In this episode, we're going to learn how security impact analysis turns change from a risky leap into a controlled decision, especially in environments where systems evolve constantly and even small updates can have outsized consequences. Many security incidents begin with a change that seemed harmless at the time, such as a configuration tweak, a permission adjustment, or a dependency update that introduced an unexpected weakness. Security impact analysis is the practice of pausing at the right moment to ask what a change could affect, what could go wrong, and what safeguards must be in place before the change moves forward. For brand new learners, the phrase can sound complicated, but the idea is straightforward. You are looking for the security consequences of a change before you create an incident that you then have to respond to under pressure. When done well, this analysis prevents outages, reduces exposure windows, and keeps the organization from accumulating hidden risk through rushed delivery. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at DailyCyber.News in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A security impact analysis is a structured way of evaluating how a proposed change could alter risk posture, including confidentiality, integrity, and availability, CIA. The analysis is not meant to be a lengthy investigation for every change, because that would slow delivery and encourage bypass. Instead, it is meant to be proportional, focusing deeper analysis on the changes that can create the largest harm. The core questions are consistent even when the systems differ. Does the change modify who can access something? Does it modify how data is handled? Does it modify what is exposed to untrusted networks? Does it modify logging and monitoring? And does it modify how the system recovers from failure? Beginners often think incidents are caused by attackers alone, but change-driven incidents are often caused by unintended consequences that create new pathways for misuse or that disable safeguards. Security impact analysis prevents that by making the invisible consequences visible while the organization still has choices. It is the difference between discovering risk in a calm planning phase and discovering it in the middle of an outage call. To see why change-driven incidents happen so often, it helps to understand that modern systems are built from many dependencies and layers, and changes ripple through those layers in ways teams may not anticipate. A change that affects authentication settings can indirectly affect access controls, token lifetimes, and service-to-service communication, which can break both security and functionality. A change that optimizes performance might disable logging or reduce monitoring detail, which can create blind spots that attackers can exploit and responders cannot investigate. A change that modifies network routing or exposure might unintentionally make an internal service reachable from outside, which increases likelihood of exploitation even if the service itself was not changed. A change that updates a library can introduce new vulnerabilities or alter how input is handled, which can create injection pathways that did not exist before. Security impact analysis exists because complexity creates surprises, and surprises are the raw material of incidents. When the analysis is built into the change process, the organization reduces surprises and therefore reduces incident probability. The first step in security impact analysis is understanding the change itself with enough clarity that you are not analyzing a vague idea. That means you identify what is changing, what components are affected, and what the change is intended to accomplish. You also clarify whether the change is temporary, experimental, or permanent, because temporary changes often become permanent if they are not managed with discipline. For a beginner, it helps to think of this as drawing a boundary around the change so you can reason about it without drifting into general worries. When a change request says improve performance, you need to know which settings or components are being adjusted, because performance changes can have security side effects like reduced visibility or weaker controls. When a change request says update access, you need to know which roles and which resources are involved, because access changes can expand privilege in ways that are difficult to unwind later. Clarity here reduces the most common analysis failure, which is missing the real impact because the change was not described precisely enough to evaluate. Once the change is defined, you evaluate the security surface it touches, and a helpful way to do that is to walk through a few consistent categories. Identity and access is one category, because changes that affect who can do what can quickly shift risk posture. Data handling is another, because changes to data storage, movement, or retention can increase impact if data is exposed or altered. Exposure and connectivity is another, because changes that open pathways between systems can expand attack surface and increase likelihood. Monitoring and logging is another, because changes that reduce visibility make both detection and investigation weaker. Resilience is another, because changes that affect recovery, rollback, or system stability can turn small mistakes into long outages that trigger emergency workarounds. Beginners sometimes think this requires advanced technical mapping, but at a high level it is about being disciplined in asking the same questions every time. The purpose is not to predict every outcome perfectly, but to avoid missing the major risk shifts that commonly cause incidents. A common misunderstanding is that security impact analysis is only about preventing unauthorized access, but in real organizations, change-driven incidents often involve availability and integrity just as much as confidentiality. A configuration change that breaks a critical service can cause an outage that triggers rushed actions, such as bypassing authentication or disabling controls to restore access quickly. A change that alters data processing logic can corrupt records silently, which creates integrity harm that may not be noticed until it causes business failures or compliance issues. A change that affects monitoring can make both outages and intrusions harder to detect, which increases impact because response begins later and with less information. Security impact analysis therefore treats the system as something that must remain dependable, not just something that must be protected from outsiders. When you bring availability and integrity into the analysis, you prevent the false comfort of thinking security is fine because no attacker was involved. Many of the most painful incidents are self-inflicted through change, and the analysis helps you prevent those by treating reliability as part of security posture. Security impact analysis also benefits from identifying trust boundaries, which are the points where one component must not blindly trust another component's input or identity. Changes that move or blur trust boundaries often create major risk shifts, even if the change seems like an architectural optimization. For example, a change that allows a service to accept requests from a broader set of callers changes the trust boundary, because now more identities can reach sensitive functionality. A change that introduces a new integration changes the boundary between your environment and an external environment, which creates new pathways for misuse and new requirements for monitoring and credential control. A change that consolidates services can create a larger blast radius, because a compromise or failure in the consolidated system can affect more functions than before. Beginners often assume boundaries are obvious, like outside versus inside, but modern environments are full of internal boundaries that matter just as much. By identifying how a change affects boundaries, you can anticipate where controls must be strengthened to prevent the change from expanding risk. Another key part of impact analysis is evaluating compensating controls, meaning safeguards that can reduce risk when the change introduces new exposure or when a full fix is not immediately possible. This matters because teams sometimes treat impact analysis as a reason to reject changes rather than as a way to make changes safer. If a change must happen quickly, you can still reduce risk by adding monitoring on sensitive actions, narrowing access scope, limiting the change to a smaller segment first, or ensuring rapid rollback capability is ready. The goal is to keep delivery moving while preventing the change from creating a long exposure window. A beginner might worry that compensating controls are just excuses, but when they are specific, time-bounded, and verified, they are practical risk management tools. They also reduce the chance that teams bypass security entirely, because the analysis provides a safe path forward instead of a hard stop. When compensating controls are integrated into the analysis, the organization gets both speed and safety rather than being forced to choose one or the other. Security impact analysis must also consider the human system around the change, because many incidents occur not because a control is missing, but because ownership and communication break down during change execution. If a change affects multiple teams, the analysis should clarify who is responsible for implementation, who verifies outcomes, and who is on call if something goes wrong. If a change modifies access, the analysis should ensure that approvals and reviews are clear and that the change will not unintentionally grant broad privilege. If a change affects monitoring, the analysis should ensure that responders know what signals to expect and where to find them. Beginners sometimes think these are management details that do not belong in security, but they directly affect incident likelihood and impact. Confusion during execution leads to misconfigurations, incomplete rollouts, and delayed detection, which are all risk amplifiers. When impact analysis includes ownership and communication readiness, it prevents change from becoming a coordination failure that turns into a security incident. Testing and validation are where security impact analysis becomes real rather than theoretical, because they provide evidence that the change behaves as intended under realistic conditions. If a change touches authentication or authorization, validation should confirm that access rules still work correctly and that no unintended pathways allow elevated actions. If a change touches data handling, validation should confirm that data remains protected and that error conditions do not leak sensitive information. If a change touches network exposure, validation should confirm that exposure is limited to what was intended and that protective boundaries remain in place. If a change touches logging, validation should confirm that critical events are still captured with enough context to support investigation. Beginners sometimes assume validation is separate from analysis, but analysis should identify what must be validated and why. Otherwise, validation becomes shallow and misses the critical risk. When validation is planned as part of the analysis, teams avoid last-minute surprises and reduce the chance of rolling back in panic after an incident begins. Rollback and recovery planning are also part of security impact analysis because the ability to recover safely is one of the strongest defenses against change-driven harm. A change that cannot be rolled back quickly increases impact because a mistake can persist longer, forcing teams into emergency workarounds. Emergency workarounds often weaken controls, broaden access, and reduce monitoring, which can create a secondary security incident on top of the operational failure. A disciplined impact analysis asks whether rollback is possible, how long it would take, and what data integrity risks exist during rollback. It also asks what monitoring will detect early warning signs so rollback can happen before widespread damage. Beginners sometimes think rollback is an engineering detail, but it is a security control because it limits exposure time and reduces the blast radius of mistakes. When rollback planning is part of the analysis, teams can deliver changes more confidently because they know they can retreat safely if reality diverges from expectations. A high-quality security impact analysis also learns from history, because past incidents and near misses often reveal where the organization is most vulnerable to change-driven failure. If the organization has had outages due to misconfigured access, the analysis should pay special attention to privilege changes and to verification of access rules. If the organization has struggled with visibility gaps, the analysis should treat logging and monitoring changes as high risk and require strong validation. If incidents have been triggered by dependency updates, the analysis should focus on how updates are tested and how exposure is monitored after deployment. Beginners sometimes assume every change is new, but organizations often repeat the same failure patterns unless they explicitly learn from them. Security impact analysis becomes more effective when it incorporates these lessons because it targets the most likely failure modes rather than treating all risk as equally abstract. This learning mindset also builds trust because teams see that analysis is based on reality and experience, not on generic caution. One of the most important outcomes of security impact analysis is a clear decision, because analysis that produces no decision simply delays work without reducing risk. The decision might be that the change can proceed as planned because risk impact is low and controls remain strong. The decision might be that the change can proceed with specific additional safeguards, such as narrower scope, extra monitoring, or enhanced validation. The decision might be that the change should be phased, starting with a small segment and expanding as evidence confirms safety. The decision might be that the change must be delayed until a critical prerequisite is met, such as establishing an owner, restoring baseline configuration, or improving rollback readiness. Beginners sometimes think analysis means saying no, but the real value is helping the organization choose a path that matches risk and capability. When decisions are explicit and justified, delivery becomes faster over time because teams stop arguing about expectations and start planning changes with known requirements. Effective impact analysis also depends on traceability, meaning the organization can connect the analysis outcomes to the change record and to the verification results after implementation. This prevents the common failure where analysis is performed, but nobody checks whether the promised safeguards were actually implemented. Traceability also supports learning, because if an incident occurs, the organization can see what assumptions were made and what signals were missed. In fast-changing environments, traceability helps prevent drift because it makes it clear what baseline protections were expected after the change and how those protections will be monitored. Beginners sometimes hear traceability and imagine heavy documentation, but the core is simply making sure decisions and evidence do not disappear. When decisions and evidence are connected, future changes become easier because teams can reuse patterns that worked and avoid patterns that failed. This is how impact analysis contributes not only to preventing a single incident, but to improving the organization's change discipline over time. As you bring this lesson together, security impact analysis is the practice of evaluating how a change could shift risk posture and then shaping the change so it does not create avoidable incidents. It begins with a clear understanding of what is changing and why, and it examines how the change touches access, data, exposure, monitoring, and resilience, using confidentiality, integrity, and availability as a steady frame. It considers trust boundaries, compensating controls, and the human coordination system that makes execution reliable. It defines what must be validated, ensures rollback and recovery are planned, and uses historical lessons to focus attention on the most likely failure modes. Most importantly, it produces an explicit decision with clear safeguards and clear evidence expectations, so change control becomes faster and safer rather than slower and contentious. When security impact analysis is integrated into normal delivery, the organization prevents a large class of change-driven incidents by catching risk shifts early, correcting them before deployment, and maintaining posture as systems continue to evolve.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.